Hi, I'm Dave Kale. Welcome to this Christian Business Insights podcast show where my goal is to provide you with practical, actionable ideas to help you create businesses and careers of excellence and at the same time multiply your influence for the kingdom. I have been a Christian in business for over 30 years, and I have personally and contractually consulted with over 500 different sales organizations. So in these podcasts, I combine the lessons that I have learned with an out-of-the-box experience and perspective on Christianity that you will find challenging. And we put that together to provide you with practical insights and ideas that you can use to live better and lead better. Welcome to the journey. Hi, this is Dave. So, what role does failure play in our development? That's what I want to talk about today. Remember, I'm not sure anybody does, remember John DeLorean? Does that name ring a bell? Well, back in the, I think it would be 70s, maybe the 80s, he was the superstar General Motor executive who started the DeLorean Motor Company. And when the company began to falter, he was arrested and charged with complicity in a drug deal that some speculated was an attempt to raise money to prop up the company. Now, all of this was big news in Detroit, where I was living at the time, and one particularly insightful article in the Detroit News theorized that he had been supremely successful his whole life, and thus never learned to deal with failure. His development was stunted by a lack of failure in his life. Faced with the pending failure of his auto company, he had nothing to lean upon and lost his moral compass. A long string of successes had not developed his character. Well, maybe. There's one thing for certain, though, regardless of the individual circumstances for Mr. DeLorean, if we choose to, we can learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. Within every failure, there is the seed of a lesson well learned, of a solid character trait emerging. It is our failures that contribute most intensely to our development. To this day, I can recall with vivid detail the events of my most humiliating failure as a salesperson. It was early in my career, decades ago, and I had made the mistake of speaking badly about the competition to a customer. Turned out the customer was a personal friend of the competitive salesperson and was personally affronted by my comment. The dressing down that I received at the hands of that customer remains painfully with me even today. I don't believe that I have ever made that mistake since. And that is one of my points. Our failures are often far more intensely painful than the corresponding highs we get when we succeed. Since the pain is far more intense, the lessons stay with us. Or at least they should, if we recognize the part that our behavior played in the failure. That's a key part of learning from our failures, recognizing the role that we played in bringing them about. Of course, sometimes we are hapless and innocent victims of chance or someone else's misbehavior, but more often than not, I think we had a hand in the development of the sequence of events which resulted in a painful loss to us. Years ago, there was a TV show called NYPD Blue, and Detective Sipowicz was one of the main characters. In one episode, the cynical Sipowicz remarked at the scene of a murder, he said, "There are no victims." In other words, the victim was in some way partially responsible for his own demise. Now, of course, that's not true for every event, because there are times when we are purely victims. But in a sober reflection of my life, which is the only thing I know well enough to make this kind of judgment about, I find it true more often than not. Most of my failures were a result of something I did. In other words, in almost every career and personal failure in my life, I was, at least in part, a contributor to the chaos that erupted. Once I realized that I am not a victim but a partial contributor, then the way is clear for me to assess my role in it and to determine never to make that mistake again. And as long as I refuse to acknowledge my role, I remain a helpless victim, forever chained to the negative consequences of the failure and powerless to do anything about it. And I allow pride to continue to reign in me, pressing out any possibility of humility taking its place. Failure, then, when our attitude is right, provides fertile ground for the sowing of life lessons which often sprout into solid character traits. In many ways, we become that which we learned from our failures. Show me a man, a person of solid, substantial character, and I'll show you someone with a list of failures in his or her background. Failure humbles us. That is one specific character trait that often sprouts from the fertile ground of multiple failures. It's hard to remain proud or arrogant when faced with the truth of several failures. Perhaps that is why the most humble of people are often those who have failed multiple times in the past. The most common defense of proud people is denial. One of the most arrogant people I've ever dealt with spent most of his time denying his culpability in even the smallest business error. Quick to point out errors in his customers, he never once said, "I'm sorry, it's our fault." Never once. His arrogance, untouched by the reality that he kept at arm's length, grew so insufferable that we could no longer stand to do business with him. Denial, then, is an indicator of the presence of pride. The opposite of denial is, of course, the acceptance of personal responsibility. It is personal responsibility, coupled with the consequences of our less than perfect actions, that help build humility. When we realize that our failure was at least in part due to our actions, it's hard to remain proud. The starting point for developing humility is the acceptance of personal responsibility for our own actions. While no one should strive to fail, if we look at every instance of our own failures as opportunities to learn and grow, and if we objectively search to identify our role in that failure, we'll come out of each better and stronger, less prideful, and more humble. Okay? Hey, one last thing before I go. I am in the process of developing a Substack page, which is a place where I eventually am going to house all of my content, and you can access it free. So that's all of my blog posts and all of my articles and podcasts. And by the way, do you know we have over 700 podcasts? Just check out the podcast page that you found this, and you'll find them going back years. Anyway, there'll be all my podcasts and my videos and lessons and so on and so forth. Eventually, all in one place, and you can get it free. So I'll put a link in the show notes and check it out. Sign up. Okay, that's it. We're done. Bye-bye.